My name is Pam Killeen, and welcome to my podcast, Circadian Reboot, where we discuss everything circadian. And today on the show, I'm pleased to announce that we have Nikko Kennedy. She is a consultant, doula, and educator elucidating the power of light to amplify and energize our innate abilities to heal and grow. Her work bridges the cutting edge of science and technology with the ancient wisdom of nature and tradition to improve outcomes of wellness and happiness from birth and beyond. She is a graduate of the University of Oregon and has completed many certifications and trainings along her learning journey. She serves as the Director of Research and Membership at the Institute of Applied Quantum Biology and Quantum Biology Collective. A consultant to many individuals and organizations pioneering awareness of circadian and quantum biology, and educator through her publication Brighter Days, Darker Nights. As a doula to families locally and around the globe, Nikko shares emotional, intellectual, and social support to families navigating their birthing years. She lives in Oregon with her husband and their 4 children. Welcome, Nikko, to my podcast, Circadian Reboot. I'm so thrilled to have you here today. You're a busy mom of 4 children, so I appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today. And I think what I'd like to focus on is perhaps your pregnancy workshop and beyond. So you talk a lot about fertility, pregnancy, post-pregnancy, and how light affects all of these different phases of a woman's life. And I'd like for you to maybe platform off of that. It's so critical. So many women out there are struggling with their fertility, and yet they probably will have a hard time believing that light has something to do with it.
Right. Absolutely. That is the central core part of my work. And it's so important not only for the moms, but also for the babies who are coming in right now, because our circadian rhythms are programmed by the time in the womb. And we're starting to find high correlation with long-term health outcomes for babies. I'm talking long-term all the way out. We're looking at dementia risk, for example, and early onset dementia and the severity of dementia is now being correlated all the way back to the circadian environment of that individual while they were in the womb, because the circadian rhythm is so integral to health. So it's absolutely lifelong impacts. So I've always been on a mission of like, the way that we welcome babies into the world is really important. And when I discovered this light piece and how important and crucial this is for setting babies up, not only to have, mamas to have like a beautiful birthing experience, which is really difficult in this day and age, but also for those babies to be as healthy and happy as possible through their childhood, puberty, adulthood, even into the way that we are potentially leaving this world and how that all is going in the end of life, looping back to the time in the womb. So for moms, if they can get their light corrected during their preconception work, it is just so powerful for how much smoother the whole process can go. And, with all of the things that we've learned, there's just really no reason not to, because so much of it is actually pretty easy. When I look at the dietary interventions, for example, it is so difficult to keep with a pregnancy diet. It is a full-time job to eat what you need to eat. And there are some amazing nutritional counselors doing super powerful work in that space. However, because of the circadian rhythms role, adding the light piece in will just supercharge everything else that a mom might be trying to do to have a healthy, happy pregnancy.
What amazed me when I listened to some of your work is that story that you talk about where women are about to give birth, they're in labor, they go rushing to the hospital, they get under those bright lights, and all of a sudden labor stops. I had never heard that in my life, but I thought to myself, if I worked at a hospital and I witnessed this time after time after time, I would start questioning what's going on here. And yet, how is this, I'm well into my 60s now, how is it now that I'm actually hearing about this for the first time?
Right. And it's so amazing. I mean, there's research showing that if you shine a green light into a laboring woman's eyes, that will slow or even stall her contractions. And yet those green frequencies, those blue frequencies are enriched in that lighting. And part of that's because the hospital environment is designed to handle emergencies. And so in an emergency situation, you need that bright light. It flips the cortisol switch on. So people are quick, they're snappy, they are ready to respond. However, that is not the way that physiological labor progresses. Physiological labor progresses non-linearly. And that is kind of a word too when we get into light. I talk about light as a cue, which is circadian health, and also light as a nutrient, which is how our body actually harnesses light to gather energy. And there's, our body has multiple ways of gathering energy from light, which is a whole other aspect of photonutrition that has a lot to do with different types of wavelengths. So we can get into all kinds of details about what does it mean to have a healthy light environment, for the birth suite, which is like a very small microcosm that really does tell a lot about the whole world, because we're also living under those kinds of bright white lights on a day-to-day basis, which have similar cortisol stimulating effects. And we always hear about cortisol as the stress hormone. And I think it's kind of difficult for people if they've heard of cortisol as a stress hormone. And then they're thinking, oh, I just need to relax. It's my fault that I feel this way. I'm anxious because of all of this stress that I'm under. And if I could just relax, I would feel better, without ever getting into that deeper level that light itself stimulates cortisol, because cortisol is what's supposed to wake us up in the morning. However, because of the artificial lights being enriched with those blue and green frequencies, we're getting that morning rush all day long, all the way until like just before bedtime, people finally flip the lights off. And so that is much, much more cortisol than we're meant to have just from the lights alone. So when people are like, oh, I just need to relax, I'm like, well, what if you just need to change out your evening light bulbs?
Hmm. Yeah, and the other side of the coin is people oversimplify the effects of light from the sun. That we're all believing that, oh, it's we need it for vitamin D.
Oh,
It's way too simplistic a view on the sun. It
mm-hmm,
does so much more than that, and we're learning like leagues and leagues and leagues of new information about the benefits of sun every year now, thankfully.
mm-hmm.
And so these women who are thinking about having children, not only do they need to consider the overstimulating effects of artificial light, they also need to enhance the natural light in their lives as well.
Yeah, I'd completely agree with that. Sunlight, nature is the golden rule. Nature is the thing that we should be measuring everything against, because nature offers, like when you look at an animal population, for example, if those animals are having trouble with something, we don't think, oh, that one just doesn't eat the right things. Right? We'd be like, hey, this population is having trouble. What's going on in the environment that the right things are not available? But with humans, we have huge, statistical resources to say that we are having collective big issues with reproductive health. However, it's put on the individual families and said, oh, well, it's this family's fault that they're having this problem because, they didn't eat right, or they were too stressed out, or, all of these individual causes, rather than looking at the systemic issue of lack of sunlight and overmuch of artificial light. And other circadian, disrupting factors like meal timing. Women work so
Mm-hmm.
hard on their pregnancy diet and eating the best that they can. I know a lot of women that, maybe don't eat the best diets, but when they're pregnant, they will make an effort for their baby to eat better. And if they knew more about circadian health, they could do even better with that by timing their meals along with the sun. Eating earlier in the day is really, really important to capitalize on the circadian digestive window that we have, especially in the morning and mid morning.
Hmm. And I learned through your work as well the importance of melatonin and what an important hormone it is. And perhaps we're focusing too much on estrogen, progesterone, for example,
Hmm.
which are huge industries, really, in terms of the bioidentical, whether they're pills or they're creams or whatever the case may be. But actually, our eye has been off the target, and we really should be looking at melatonin for hormonal health.
Yeah, it's amazing. Melatonin is absolutely a reproductive hormone, and also the endocannabinoid system is another one that it fires based on sunlight and is looped in with the circadian rhythm and has huge amounts of activity that we've been overlooking in terms of the reproductive processes. So it's another realm of the neurotransmitters. We're looking at the hormones of reproduction, but what about the neurotransmitters of reproduction? That are looped in with the circadian rhythm. It's a whole other aspect that relates, directly to women's subjective experience. Like the bliss hormone is one of the endocannabinoids that has had a huge amount of research in early pregnancy. It skyrockets, drops down in the middle. When labor starts, that bliss hormone should be really climbing to a high point. Birth should be like transformative kind of experience. But when dealing with circadian disruption that's suppressing melatonin, suppressing the endocannabinoid system, suppressing all of these hormones and neurotransmitters, then it's much more difficult to access those alternate transcendental states that women historically would have been relying on to overcome the intensity of the childbirth process. But nowadays, we're getting synthetic oxytocin, pitocin, to augment labor for upwards of 25% of women are not being going into labor naturally. They're getting stimulated to go into labor by medical processes. That pitocin doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So we hear about oxytocin as the hug hormone, but from women who have reported to me what pitocin feels like, it does not feel like a hug. Because it doesn't interact with the brain, it's only giving the physical stimulation, and that oxytocin should be looped in with melatonin, which is a circadian hormone. Melatonin is also produced under sunlight and infrared light by mitochondria. So that there are other sources of melatonin besides the circadian rhythm. And there's actually been really good research lately about using red light therapy to help with labor pain. Because melatonin acts on the peripheral nerves, like on the outer nerves, as well as in the central nervous system to help mediate pain. So when women are getting pitocin, when they're also supplemented with melatonin at the same time, there's potentially a lower dose of pitocin that's needed. So there's really good research about using exogenous melatonin for women who are already in trouble for preeclampsia, which is a really severe pregnancy disease. It's also really good research. However, if women can, for example, take my workshop, learn how to program their circadian rhythms themselves, learn how to get out and have safe solar exposure, they can be producing all of their own circadian endocannabinoids, melatonin, all of these hormones that are so needed and so overlooked in the conventional paradigm. That ideally they'll be, skipping over all of the need for any of that medical intervention, because
So
their
you're
body can do
encouraging,
it themselves.
exactly, the way nature intended. So you're
Yeah.
encouraging women, obviously, to go out into the sun to expose themselves to the infrared. But are hospitals actually using infrared lights? I mean, a lot of people are buying them for home use. Would hospitals entertain that idea?
Absolutely. Many women that I'm talking with are bringing their own red light panels. And
Oh,
the hospitals, if you want to bring in your own lights, that's fine. They let you bring in your own like diffuser for aromatherapy. So why not bring in your own lights? It's absolutely happening. Places that allow water birth, that's part of how water birth is effective. Um, and lately, there has even been the use of cold water therapy to help women with their labor pains too. And that was something that really blew my mind when I was thinking about and starting to learn about all of these effects of light and how light and heat are just different wavelengths. And then I started hearing about like hot therapy and cold therapy, and it was like, if heat is good, how can cold also be good? Like, we're used to dichotomies as being bad, opposites. Usually we think of as like the good one and the bad one. But when it comes to like light and darkness, light isn't bad or darkness good or vice versa. They are balance, right? They are counterparts to each other. And so same with heat therapies and cold therapies, they really go hand in hand. And they each have really beneficial effects to mitochondrial health, can both be used for pain management, and really both potentially have room to be used in pregnancy care, the labor suite, and postpartum care.
Now, I heard you talk about morning sickness and how that is related to a circadian problem as well. I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
women are going to be interested in learning about that connection. Can you share a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So morning sickness, looking into it, and it's interesting because this also relates to newborn jaundice. So morning sickness and newborn jaundice are both related to something that's called oxidative stress. So oxidative stress is when our redox balance, which is our electrical balance in cells, is tipped towards too much positive charge. And again, we're so used to hearing positive good, negative bad, right? Of like hearing this dichotomy and this like opposite kind of thinking. But when we're looking at redox, oxidative stress, we want a balance between the positive and negative charges in the body. And the modern environment, modern lifestyle, we are not connected with earth anymore. We hardly ever barefoot and ground. Where historically we were connecting with the Earth's field a lot, and that pulls in a lot of negative charge electrons. And then also the circadian rhythm controls our endogenous antioxidant production. So glutathione and melatonin being two of the really well-known ones. And when we see women that have severe morning sickness, and when we see babies that have jaundice, severe jaundice, in both cases, there is a lack of those endogenous antioxidants. So the process of growing a baby fires up the mitochondria. Mitochondria are our energy production. We need a lot of energy to make a baby. So in the first trimester, all of that extra mitochondrial activity is generating what's called ROS, reactive oxygen species, which carry a positive charge. Normally, the glutathione, melatonin, endogenous antioxidants touching the earth, all of those things would bring in extra electrons to balance out the charges. But when women who have these severe morning sicknesses, especially that persist into the second trimester, we really see that those endogenous support systems are lacking. And so all of that extra positive charge is what makes women feel extra queasy. And then that's also what mediates the negative impacts in the newborn babies, because when they switch babies after they're born, they're switching from umbilical processes for getting their oxygen to breathing air oxygen, right? Reactive oxygen species. That process is very intense. It is an oxidative stress process. A healthy baby can handle it, but a baby that's challenged has more difficult time with that. And a lot of that can have to do with their redox state and how healthy their endogenous antioxidant production is, and how their mother's circadian rhythm was in the womb. And babies don't make their own melatonin for the first about 6 weeks of life. Melatonin in babies actually comes from the mother's breast milk, which is related to her circadian rhythm because it should be that nighttime. So that nighttime feed should be delivering a really high dose of melatonin. But a lot of, babies are getting formula fed through that time, especially NICU babies. And those NICU babies are really the ones that have the hardest time with newborn jaundice. So there's so much that we can do. We can ground the incubators. We can work on getting melatonin supplemented for the babies that are getting formula in that time, right? And looking in these redox patterns.
Yeah.
And so I actually have a whole text-based course about newborn jaundice and have an amazing testimonial from a woman who had her first baby was a NICU baby with ABO blood incompatibility jaundice. Her second baby, she's like, Nikko, I followed all of your advice. I lived outside my whole pregnancy. I was in the garden. I was in the sunshine. I had bare feet. And then her second baby, healthy, big baby boy, born at home, same father, same risk of ABO intolerance jaundice, but no jaundice whatsoever. And a totally happy, cozy postpartum. She said he slept great from day one. So I know for a fact that this stuff works because I'm seeing the testimonials roll in, and it's just so beautiful that families, even that have had really traumatic, difficult, challenging experiences with earlier pregnancies, can reboot their circadian rhythm. I love the name of your podcast, by the way. Reboot the circadian rhythm, get back in touch with the real frequencies of nature, with light as a cue, light as a nutrient, and then go on to have really beautiful, empowering experiences bringing future babies into the world.
Now, I think you'll know about this story. There was a nurse in a hospital back in the 40s or the 50s, and when newborns were born with jaundice, she took them outside, and they were cured. And somehow or another, the hospitals, instead of taking the children outside, developed the blue light therapy to hold over the gallbladder area to help alleviate the jaundice. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
do you know a lot more detail on that story, or is that basically it?
Oh, yeah, it's beautiful. And they've actually done further research on that for low resource areas that can't afford those fancy blue light phototherapies, and found equal, if not better, results because there's actually lower risk of sunlight compared with the blue light therapies. And there's some of the research coming out about the negative effects of newborn jaundice are saying that it might actually be the intensive therapy contributing to these negative effects equally or maybe more than the jaundice itself, which is very concerning. But from these studies in these lower resource areas where they're using filtered sunlight, they say it's equally, if not more effective for mild to severe newborn jaundice. So absolutely, sunlight still works. Sunlight has always been the gold standard for treating newborn jaundice. And when you get at the root of it being a potentially circadian rhythm regulated problem, then it makes all the more sense. And there's also a lot of information, for families who might be going through that the time of day really matters, because bilirubin is a circadian it's regulated in a circadian pathway. And actually, when you look at seasonal affective disorder, problems in bilirubin are a biomarker of seasonal affective disorder, which also has deep roots with the circadian rhythm. So all kinds of interesting things. And bilirubin also is a powerful antioxidant, which gets back to that oxidative stress issue where when babies are reuptaking their bilirubin, they're using that process. The reuptake process actually generates a lot of free electrons that can help balance the oxidative stress that baby's going into. So jaundice is actually really a very wise thing for babies to be going through. It's just that it needs to stay out of the brain. And so that actually relates to protecting the blood-brain barrier. That relates to what kind of medications are being used for that baby. That relates to the electromagnetic environment for that baby, because one of the big problems in the NICU environment, which is the most dangerous place to be having newborn jaundice, is the EMFs, right? There's so much monitoring equipment. The incubators and all of the equipment generate these electromagnetic fields. And one of the most well-documented effects of electromagnetic fields is opening calcium channels in cells. They're electric gates, voltage-gated channels. So when those fields reach the body, they open up this free calcium. And when you look at what mediates newborn jaundice damage and what's the difference between a baby with high circulating bilirubin and no damage and a baby with high circulating bilirubin and central nervous system damage, intracellular calcium is the bottleneck. It is the last, big thing that everything else comes down to that one issue. So really great research about grounding incubators, even getting 18 inches of space between baby and the electrical equipment you can measurably reduce the charge on that baby's skin. So huge potential to help so many babies with this information about light, electromagnetism, circadian rhythms, redox and oxidative stress. All of it is so important for this really vital time period.
And I know that you talk about women breastfeeding and how dangerous it is to, hold their cell phones near the baby and so on. And it involves this calcium channel. They really should keep these electronic devices away from a baby.
Yeah, definitely. And, part of it is that babies, their nervous system is not yet myelinated. Myelin is like a fatty covering on the nerves. So they're just more sensitive to being stimulated by that stuff than someone who is fully myelinated. It actually takes until around until the mid-20s for that myelination process. So this is also really a big deal for like today's teens, for example, who are around EMFs for school, holding these devices, some of them, sleeping with the devices, using the devices in bed, which really should be their restorative time, and instead having these really high frequencies. This is one of the mechanisms by which certain people have really negative outcomes around smart meters, because those electrical smart meters release a large electromagnetic field. So I've been talking with some different building biologists who really study the environment. And they recommend at least 10 feet of space between a smart meter and a sleeping arrangement. So that's like, it feels really overwhelming when you start to think about how ubiquitous these, technologies and everything are. But I love bringing it back down to, there are really practical things like 10 feet of space between a smart meter and a bed. 18 inches of space between a bed and a wall, like a regular wall outlet, right? Like cell phones have that. If you read into the, terms of service and everything, they have a recommendation for how much space that device should be away from your body
And
to safely use
baby
it.
monitors. Yeah, baby monitors too.
Mm-hmm.
They must emit a very strong, powerful field, right?
Yeah.
They've got to
Mm-hmm.
be a certain distance from the baby as well, I'm
Yeah.
sure.
Definitely. And I also recommend that for vehicles too. My husband and I had a vehicle that we measured, and there was actually a very large battery unit underneath one of the seats. So once we found that out, it was like, oh, well, definitely don't put the baby seat over that seat that has the battery, because when reading it with a meter, it was putting off a very large electromagnetic field. So vehicles are another hidden source of electromagnetic radiation. That, when we think about why are our drives, why are our commutes so taxing, for anyone who's driving a hybrid car, and that car wasn't even a hybrid, but it was, a high energy efficient vehicle, look around it, because it might be putting off really high EMF fields, and that may be part of why that commute is so draining.
Mm-hmm. And we've talked about, before pregnancy, during pregnancy and labor and so on and so forth. Um, so many women today are struggling with postpartum depression.
Mm.
And I wonder, you must work with ladies who are struggling in that department. What kind of advice do you give to them?
Oh, absolutely. It's a really big deal. And I actually just published a some of the data from my most recent postpartum, actually. And so I'm doing a really good job at managing my circadian health to the best of my ability. And I, through my most recent pregnancy, my fourth baby, I actually tracked using a sleep tracker to see how was all of, how were things going? What was my sleep like? And so I just shared all of that data. And one of the scores that my tracker was giving me was like a readiness score. And it was amazing to see my third trimester readiness score dropping. And then right before birth, it actually climbed again. This is when I went on maternity leave. And also, we always talk about that nesting urge. And I was like, wow, look at that. You can actually see where I got a surge of energy right before birth. And then birth, of course, my readiness score dropped. It's an intense process, and caring for a baby around the clock. And, dealing with everything postpartum. One of the big things that's overlooked is that during pregnancy, the placenta is giving a huge amount of hormones and things to not only the baby, but the mother. And so the placenta is actually nurturing the mother. People always think of it as nurturing the baby, but it's actually nurturing the mother too. And one of the things the placenta produces is melatonin. So circulating melatonin climbs and climbs and climbs and reaches a high peak. Some of the highest circulating melatonin you'd ever see in a person is right at the onset of labor. Well, once that placenta is delivered, that source of melatonin goes away. And most women don't know to protect their circadian rhythms from artificial light at night. And so when they're doing their diaper changes and things, or if their baby's fussy, they might not know. And especially for women that are formula feeding and not getting that melatonin to the baby on a rhythmic cycle, who might be opening fridges, turning on lights in order to heat up water for formula and all of that stuff that can be really disrupting to the circadian rhythm. And And in animal models, you can induce depression by giving them artificial light during their rest cycle, right? So it's like really direct links between melatonin, circadian rhythms, mental health disorders. But even in a healthy postpartum like I had, still a month later, 2 months later, I still had not bounced back even to my third trimester level. I definitely was not back at my like normal everyday level of health and vitality. But many women at 6 weeks are being told that they need to go back to work, or their husbands are going back to work, leaving them isolated and alone at a phase when they're less free than they've ever been in their entire lives for a new mother, right? Under extreme tiredness, extreme isolation, extreme hormonal flux, missing all of that placental nourishment. And it's a really difficult time. So I do have specific advice for that time period, which is really to go back to traditional care, because in ancient times, we knew how to take care of new mamas, and they were, confined, the confinement, they were on bed rest in a warm, cozy den. And what actually happens when you're in a warm, cozy den without a whole lot of light stimulation and no blue light, especially at night, sleep naturally, we go into a polyphasic sleep pattern. And we have lost polyphasic sleep due to circadian disruption. So it's not something you can healthily do in an environment full of artificial light. In our modern light cycles, we sleep all at once 8 hours in a big block, and that's considered sufficient. However, historically, that's not how humans slept. And postpartum particularly, that is not at all a possibility for new moms. So they need to be spending at least 14 hours in darkness. And they need to be sleeping in a polyphasic pattern where they're sleeping for a couple of hours, waking up to take care of their baby, going back to sleep. And with the sleep tracker, I was able to see this for myself and see what it would look like to spend 12 hours in bed and only get 8.5 hours of sleep broken up into little chunks. But I actually was feeling pretty good. And this is a drastic difference compared with my first, where I was still under the belief that 8 hours of sleep a night should be enough, and that if I was getting 10 hours of sleep, that was a lot and I should be fine. But if I got 10 hours of sleep, with the regular lights, I still didn't feel fine. However, spending longer in bed is a really important part. And so I have a blog post about circadian postpartum. And so like there's that first phase, and then there's the next phase of introducing baby to sunlight. And it's so cool. There's a case study from the 90s where a baby was exposed to no artificial light whatsoever. And that baby was having circadian entrainment markers so much earlier than what we consider as normal. And one of the big things with circadian research is that right now, it's all being conducted in people who have basically been living in circadian disruption for a couple of generations. So we don't actually know what is optimal based on today's studies. But even with looking at modern, research, we can say stabilizing and strengthening circadian rhythms is a really powerful way to support young families.
Absolutely. And I think you said that babies take 2 to 3 years to develop a circadian rhythm.
Yep, for it to fully develop.
Yeah, yeah. And that's largely dependent on the health of the mother, and not just the habits of the son, but the mother as well, and breastfeeding, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, breastfeeding, the family's habits, and and just that time for all of those, processes to come online. And a lot of it has to do with the development of the digestive system. Because, we know babies have, their stomachs are so tiny when they're born. And so they need to eat a lot more than adults need to eat. So part of it is also like getting their meal times and their digestive system up and ready to eat a breakfast, lunch, dinner, maybe a couple snacks, and be okay, rather than this like continuous feed. And feeding around the clock too, of like, when are they ready to let go of nighttime nursing?
Now, when we talk about puberty and boys and girls, are we having late onset, early onset? What's your opinion? I'm hearing different views on that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There are some really big challenges with puberty. And this is another reason that I'm very passionate about helping families through pregnancy and postpartum, because what we think of as puberty is actually the third puberty. So if things are having trouble by the third puberty, most likely that trouble started in the first and second. They call them mini puberties. And so the first is in the womb, the first round of sexual development, where, initially, and, everyone always knows like, oh, you can't find out the gender until a certain date, because up until that date, humans develop the same. And then there's the first differentiation. And that time period, that first differentiation, is highly susceptible to endocrine disruptors, environmental toxins, and it's also regulated by the circadian rhythm of the mother. All of those things happening, all of those hormones being in the right balance. So that's the first opportunity to help. When you're pregnant, you're in early pregnancy, you're not necessarily thinking like, oh, what I'm doing right now might be influencing how my baby approaches puberty, 10, 12 years from now. Mm-hmm. The second mini puberty begins at birth, where there's another big difference in the hormonal profiles of babies, if they're boys versus if they're girls. So for girls, it lasts that full 2 to 3 years. For boys, it's only about 6 months. But the first 6 months of a boy's life, his testosterone is raging. And this is part of what fuels the difference in growth patterns between boys and girls. So that's a really important time to be establishing circadian health, because the circadian health established in the womb and infancy usually carries through. And that's what that individual is going to have set as their normal. That's what's going to feel normal for them. That's what they're going to generally head towards. So we hear about, night owls and like, oh, I've been a night owl my whole life, and things like that are set in that time. So really important to be getting adequate sunshine for the first 6 months of life. So I talked earlier about, the phases of postpartum. The initial phase is that warm, cozy lion. The next phase is starting to entrain to the sun, bringing baby outside, and they see the best physical, mental, immune development in babies who are getting about 14 or more hours per week, over 2 hours per day of natural sunlight. So that is so important for the hormones, because the hormones are triggered by sunlight. So UV, we have infrared light, we have UVA and UVB. And those each stimulate different things in our body. This is part of what I was talking about. We have light as a cue saying, now it's time to do this, right? Giving this nice even across the day. But we also have the frequency of the light saying specifically, what does this mean? So like thyroid, for example, is really activated by UVA light, whereas as you were talking about, vitamin D production and a whole host of other things are by that UVB light, right? And so babies need all of the different kinds of light in order for their hormones to be flowing well for growth, for motor development and all of those things. So those are the first two opportunities for setting babies up to have a healthy puberty. And we see melatonin levels like in babies, they don't produce measurable amounts of their own melatonin, but in childhood they do. And it's climbing high. Melatonin production in childhood is really, really high. And then guess what point it starts dropping off? Puberty. When melatonin starts dropping off, puberty starts.
Interesting.
So then when fertility wanes, melatonin wanes, because it's continuously declining across the lifespan. And right now it's kind of a toss-up in research. How much of that is physiological? We need, melatonin to deal with advanced mitochondrial activity, right? So during growth and reproduction, we're using more energy than in older age. So there could be some less need for melatonin, but there also is mitochondrial health tends to decline over age, as well as pineal gland calcification interrupts the melatonin production in the brain, which is the circadian melatonin production. So, part of it, like how much of it's physiological and how much of it is driven by the modern lifestyle. And we're even starting to see pineal gland calcification even in children, which is very alarming. Because calcification is very much a part of the aging process. And you hear that calcium, and we were talking about the EMFs, like letting the calcium out of cells where it's supposed to be and letting it into the other spaces. So definitely, I believe EMFs, based on reading research are relating to this. Also, the widespread use of fluoridation, because fluoride also increases calcification. Fluoride also inhibits melatonin. And then the whole slew of endocrine disrupting chemicals. So it is a big challenge, puberty these days. And, just knowing that. So, we do see some individuals are entering puberty early, others are entering puberty late. Many are reporting significant emotional struggles during that time. Mental health challenges really start to show up at that time. And part of it is losing the protective melatonin of childhood, and some of the other hormonal factors like estrogen is protective against mental health issues. So many times boys will start showing mental health troubles earlier in age than girls do because they don't have this protective estrogen. And so then when you think about the desirability of, maybe being more feminine, maybe grabbing onto more body fat and things, as we're seeing, and a lot of today's youth, that part of that is to protect against potentially the negative effects of electromagnetic radiation and widespread circadian disruption, like unprecedented levels of cortisol and suppressing the sex hormones, is really it's a big topic and a big issue. And when you look at the treatments, when they give puberty blockers to kids, that's mediating a circadian pathway. So, if you really want to get me started, but
it's going to have a domino effect. Yeah.
Very, exactly.
Very sad.
So, like you talked about postpartum depression earlier, and I wanted to bring up one other thing that I wanted to talk about there, and that I didn't, which was that recently there was a new treatment created for dealing with postpartum depression, a 1-week treatment that targets the GABA pathway. And this, again, the GABA pathway is also related to circadian rhythm. And so we've been talking about hormones, and we have cortisol being the daytime wake up hormone, melatonin being the nighttime go to sleep hormone. Well, in the neurology, we have the same thing. We have the glutamate system being the activating force and the GABA system being the deactivating force, right? And so they found that if they influence the GABA system, they could help reduce that postpartum depression, which again links back to it probably being a circadian mediated issue. So, over and over and over again, you can look at so many different health issues that are going on, and they all tie back to this single, root thing of like, what is our light environment like? How is the light dark cycle happening in the environment? And then when you look at all the processes that are supposed to be regulated by that, if those processes are getting deregulated, then it makes sense that all of these other things, downstream are also showing signs of trouble.
Absolutely. And then if we fast forward to menopause, I mean, so many women are struggling today, and they're normalizing all of these challenges women have, that, they're perimenopausal, they're having symptoms in their 30s. I mean, they're hormonal wrecks today.
Yeah.
And, there's so many things being thrown at them, and yet they don't have the solution lying in a healthy circadian pattern and seeking out more sunlight.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the entire endocrine system is in a feedback loop with the circadian rhythm. So yeah, for women in the perimenopause camp of that early onset menopause, it is definitely can be helped with recognizing that those women generally are in that camp that their melatonin has started dropping off faster than normal, and their redox is imbalanced, tipped towards oxidative stress due to lack of endogenous antioxidants. And then a huge one is that I've talked a lot today about the endocannabinoid system, because it's so fascinating with regard to how interrelated it is with the whole reproductive system and sunlight and the circadian rhythm. And one of the big challenges is that it is the endocannabinoids are all created from DHA and EPA, the essential fatty acids from seafood. And so many women have been taught to fear seafood. And so their cells are deprived of these essential fatty acids. And so they literally can't produce the levels of endocannabinoids that should be mediating their appetite and their mood and the reproductive cycles, and the endocannabinoids are also massive antioxidant. And what's so powerful about having seafood consumption be a regular part of the diet is that it's very well recycled in the body. And so the endocannabinoids, they get, the sunlight and circadian triggers make the endocannabinoids flow. And then the body just reabsorbs them back into the cell walls and then lets them out and brings them back in. So it's a very highly conserved process, which I think is just so cool because, usually we think of like you eat food and then it passes through you. You burn it up for energy and then it passes through you. And then the next day you have to eat more food. But with these fats, vitamin D is this way too. The recyclability of vitamin D and the endocannabinoids is really, really high when those systems are functioning well. So I think that is really, really cool. And also for women in perimenopause, it's also really cool that they can potentially start doing a small thing that will add up to greater and greater effects, right? As their body's able to hold on to more and more of that and displace more of the not as good fats that are currently, blocking up those spots in their cells.
Well, that's fantastic. It's such great information. I wish you were my neighbor because I'd pick your brain every single day. Oh my God, your wealth of knowledge. Is there anything that you're working on right now that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I have all kinds of things going on. So I publish at brighterdaysdarkernights.com, and I'm also on Instagram as at brighterdays.darkernights. And I am currently working, I have a lot of resources for parents and families, but I also am creating a program, the Circadian and Quantum Childbearing Year, that is for practitioners who want to go into all of this information at a really high level and you go high and deep and have personal support from me. So if they have clients, they can come in and talk to me about their client issues and then be able to go back and refer. So I have, osteopaths, chiropractors, nutritionists, doctors, all kinds of really high level, midwives and doulas, people who are helping families and who are learning this information. And then they are going on to write and publish and teach and spread the word about how potent this is. So there's all kinds of testimonials on my site, and it is a great time to jump in and become a leader in this field that families are really, they're hungry for something that will actually move the needle. And, Circadian Reboot, you can start to feel differences in like 2 to 3 days. It's so fast. And so people are so much more likely to stick with it than like a diet protocol that takes like 6 weeks to 6 months to start showing signs. That's really hard to get people to jump through. But when you can lead them into something that within 2 to 3 days, they're feeling better and seeing reductions in their symptoms, that's potent. So that's what I'm most excited about right now, is getting more people on board.
Yeah. Well, that's so important for our next generation. My final question to you is, what is your dream circadian day?
Oh, wonderful. Well, of course, it depends on the season, but generally what my day looks like, I wake up and I head on outside and have my bare feet on the earth, even when it's cold. And am getting that morning sunlight through my eyes. I wear glasses, but I take my glasses off for my morning solar exposure. I come back inside and I make breakfast for the family, and we all actually the whole family goes outside. As each person wakes up, they trickle outside for their own outside time. They all are in the flow of doing this. And then after breakfast, it's back outside for that UVA rise. So we get the initial early morning sunrise, then we get a nice big meal, and then we get that mid-morning light and just continue going outside through the day. Around sunset, we switch. So we have like 3 layers of lighting. We have overhead bright white lighting for daytime. Then we have like eye level lighting that's kind of more like amber and yellow. And then we have floor lighting that's deep red. And so as the sun goes down, we turn off the overheads for the mid lighting. And then as the sun goes even further, we turn off the mid lighting for the deep red. And that's especially important for the winter time when we do spend more time awake. And sometimes light candles. The kids love a, candlelit dinner or coloring session. Kids are fascinated by by light, and they love going outside for nature. And so, yeah, raising my family in this way where they just are normalizing this is really important. That's my ideal, is that, future generations, they just feel how this is, and they just live in a way that's just a little bit more balanced and a little bit more in tune with nature.
Well, thank you so much for doing your research, for sharing your information, for being such a wealth of knowledge. And I invite everybody to visit your websites. I know you have a couple of websites,
Mm-hmm.
nikkokennedy.com and
That's right.
Brighter Lights, Darker Days, and
Brighter days, darker
brighter,
nights.
oh, Brighter Days, Darker Nights. I'm
Yep.
sorry. And anyway,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd love to have you back on the show so we can maybe get into a little bit more detail about your research as well.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Pam, for inviting me. It was a pleasure to talk with you. And thank you for doing your research, because it was so fun to answer your questions that were so well thought out, and gave such a good spread of knowledge for people that are looking for that, introduction, the introductory deep dives. And yeah, I would love to come back and chat again with you.
That'd be awesome. You're very kind. Thank you so much. Thank you for taking your valuable time to join us today. The information provided on my website, community forum, and podcast is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as medical advice. We are not licensed medical professionals, and the content shared here is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you are seeking health advice or have specific medical concerns, we strongly encourage you to consult with a qualified medical doctor or healthcare provider. They are trained to evaluate your individual health needs and provide personalized recommendations tailored to your unique circumstances. By accessing and using my website, participating in my member forum, or listening to my podcast, you agree to acknowledge and abide by this disclaimer. We do not assume any responsibility or liability for actions taken based on the information provided herein.